For most of the 20th century, the story that Korea and Japan told about themselves was simple, clean, and deeply reassuring. Koreans descended from an unbroken line stretching back to a legendary founding king who ruled 5,000 years ago. Japan's imperial family traced its lineage directly to a sun goddess, an unbroken chain of divine rulers presiding over a people who had lived on those islands since time immemorial. Both stories shared the same basic promise, that the people living there today were the same people, biologically and culturally, who had always been there. Ancient DNA has just taken that promise apart, piece by piece, and what it found instead is stranger, messier, and in some ways far more remarkable than the myths it replaced. Because when geneticists finally got their hands on bones buried in Korean soil for over 6,000 years, and skeletons preserved in Japanese shell mounds for even longer than that, the genetic code inside those bones didn't match the modern populations living in the same places today. Not closely, in some cases, barely at all. Something had happened on this peninsula and these islands, something ancient historians never fully grasped and modern nationalist mythology never accounted for. A demographic event so complete that the original inhabitants of Korea and Japan were almost entirely erased from the gene pool of the people who now call those places home. If you want to understand where modern Koreans and Japanese actually came from, and why that answer has become one of the most quietly explosive findings in East Asian archaeology, stay with this, because the DNA tells a story that neither national myth was ever built to survive. Let's start with Korea, because the deep background matters here. The Korean peninsula has been continuously inhabited for at least 40,000 years, through ice ages, warming periods, and dramatic shifts in coastline and climate. For nearly all of that time, the people living there survived as hunter-gatherers, following game, fishing the rivers, gathering wild plants, exactly the kind of subsistence lifestyle that defined most of humanity for most of human history. Then, roughly 3,500 years ago, something changed abruptly. Rice farming appeared on the peninsula, and it didn't arrive gradually, the way you might expect a useful new technique to slowly spread between neighboring groups. It showed up essentially fully formed, complete with sophisticated irrigation systems and specialized agricultural tools, creating a sharp, visible break in the archaeological record between what came before and what came after. For a long time, the standard historical assumption was straightforward. The existing hunter-gatherer population had simply learned new farming techniques from contact with neighboring cultures and carried on with their lives, same people, new skills. Ancient DNA proved that assumption wrong in a way that stunned the researchers who found it. In 2020, a team of geneticists extracted genetic material from human remains recovered at the Taejong-ni site in South Korea, dated to precisely the period when rice farming first appeared on the peninsula. What they found didn't match the local hunter-gatherers who had lived there for tens of thousands of years. It matched populations from the Yangtze River Valley in southern China. These early farmers weren't converts. They were immigrants, and their DNA proved it. But the picture that emerged wasn't a single clean migration either. The genetic signal in these early Korean farmers turned out to be a genuine mixture, carrying ancestry from at least 3 distinct populations. Southern Chinese rice farmers from the Yangtze Basin, a separate genetic signature tracing back to the Yellow River region in northern China, and a smaller residual trace of the original Korean hunter-gatherers who had occupied the peninsula before any of this began. What the DNA was describing wasn't a violent conquest, and it wasn't a simple cultural handoff either. It was something more gradual, and in its own quiet way, just as total. A population replacement carried out not through warfare, but through sheer demographic math. Rice farming allowed for dramatically higher population density than hunting and gathering ever could, which meant the incoming farmers could simply have more children, build larger and more permanent settlements, and expand across more territory generation after generation. The original hunter-gatherer population didn't vanish overnight. Some groups mixed directly with the newcomers and were absorbed into farming communities. Others retreated toward marginal land where agriculture was difficult or impossible, holding on to their older way of life for a while longer at the margins. But within roughly 1,000 years, the genetic signature of Korea's original inhabitants had been diluted down to almost nothing. Modern Koreans today carry only around 10% ancestry traceable to those ancient hunter-gatherers. The remaining 90% traces back to the rice farming migrants who arrived from China 3,500 years ago. The idea of an unbroken Korean bloodline stretching back tens of thousands of years, in other words, simply doesn't survive contact with the genetic evidence. Modern Koreans are, genetically speaking, descended primarily from agricultural migrants who moved in from China and demographically overwhelmed the people who were already there. Now, here's where more recent research adds a layer of nuance the earlier rice-focused story didn't fully capture, because rice wasn't actually the first wave of this story, and it wasn't the only crop that mattered. In 2021, a large international team led by linguist Martine Robitz at the Max Planck Institute combining genetic data with archaeological site records and a database of more than 3,000 word roots across nearly 100 languages, traced something even older than rice farming back to a specific origin point, the West Liao River Valley in what's now northeastern China, where communities were cultivating a grain called broom corn millet as far back as 9,000 years ago. According to this research, the deep ancestral roots of an entire language family that modern linguists call Trans-Eurasian, a family that includes Korean and Japanese alongside Mongolic, Tungusic, and Turkic languages, can be traced back to these early millet farmers, whose descendants carried a distinct genetic profile. Researchers now label Amur-related ancestry outward across Northeast Asia over thousands of years, mixing along the way with Yellow River populations, and eventually with the indigenous hunter-gatherer populations of Korea and Japan, picking up rice cultivation itself as a secondary addition to an already moving agricultural and linguistic package. It's a more complicated picture than a single Yangtze rice migration, and it remains genuinely debated among specialists, with some archaeogeneticists pushing back hard against parts of the model. But the broad strokes line up with, and actually deepen, exactly the pattern the Korean skeletal DNA already pointed to. Successive waves of continental farmers, carrying new crops, new tools, and new languages, gradually and repeatedly overwhelming the older hunter-gatherer populations already living across the peninsula. Now, let's turn to Japan, because if Korea's story is dramatic, Japan's is even more so. The Japanese archipelago was first settled somewhere around 38,000 years ago, back when lower sea levels connected the islands to the Asian mainland by land bridges that would later disappear underwater. The people who settled there became known to archaeologists as the Jomon culture, named for the distinctive cord-marked pottery they produced, some of the oldest pottery traditions found anywhere on Earth. The Jomon lived as hunter-gatherers for an almost unbelievable 16,000 years, developing sophisticated tools, elaborate ceramic traditions, complex spiritual and burial practices, and permanent settlements supported by Japan's unusually resource-rich coastal and forest environments. Then, around 3,000 years ago, rice farming arrived. And just like in Korea, it arrived suddenly and essentially fully developed, complete with irrigation systems and wet rice cultivation techniques that transformed how people could live on the islands. This period, beginning around 900 BCE, is known as the Yayoi period, named after farmers who began migrating into Japan from the Korean peninsula, first appearing in northern Kyushu before gradually spreading across Honshu over the following centuries, bringing bronze tools, eventually iron weapons, and agricultural systems capable of supporting populations far beyond anything hunting and gathering could sustain. Historians and archaeologists had understood the broad outline of the Yayoi migration for decades before genetics entered the picture. What nobody fully appreciated until ancient DNA analysis matured was just how completely these migrants replaced the Jomon population they encountered. In 2019, a large genetic study analyzing DNA recovered from dozens of Jomon skeletons, alongside hundreds of modern Japanese individuals, produced results that stunned anthropologists working in the field. Modern Japanese people derive somewhere between roughly 80 and 90% of their ancestry from Yayoi-associated rice farmers. Only 10 to 20% traces back to the original Jomon inhabitants who had lived on the islands for 16 millennia and developed one of the oldest and most sophisticated pottery traditions anywhere in the ancient world. Genetically, the Jomon contributed almost nothing to the population that exists in Japan today. The evidence suggests they were pushed to the margins as Yayoi farming communities expanded, with some Jomon groups mixing into farming populations and being absorbed, and others retreating into mountainous regions in the far north, areas less suited to rice cultivation, where the older hunting and gathering lifestyle could still function a while longer. That retreat left one especially important genetic trace behind. The Ainu people of Hokkaido, Japan's northernmost island, maintained hunting and gathering lifeways into the modern era, and carry significantly more Jomon-derived ancestry than mainland Japanese populations do, making them the closest living genetic link to Japan's original inhabitants. But even the Ainu experienced dramatic population decline and sustained cultural suppression, particularly after Japan's modernization in the 19th century, when policies of forced assimilation and land seizure devastated Ainu communities and reduced their population to a small fraction of what it had once been. Functionally speaking, pure Jomon ancestry no longer exists as an intact population anywhere. A lineage that survived on these islands for 16,000 years, through ice ages, sea level changes, and everything else the Pleistocene and early Holocene could throw at it, was almost entirely genetically absorbed within the span of a few thousand years once agriculture arrived. If you're the kind of person who finds it fascinating just how thoroughly a population's identity can be rewritten by genetics without anyone realizing it happened in real time, that's exactly the kind of buried history this channel keeps digging into. So consider subscribing if you haven't already. because the deeper genetic picture connecting Korea and Japan gets even stranger from here. Because where did the Yayoi migrants who transformed Japan actually come from? The genetic trail runs straight back through Korea. The Yayoi population that crossed into Japan originated in the southern Korean peninsula, but as the Korean genetic evidence already established, those Koreans were themselves descendants of Chinese origin farming populations who had migrated into Korea centuries earlier. That makes the Yayoi migrants, in a real sense, a second wave in a much longer chain, carriers of an agricultural and genetic package that originated far to the west, moved through the Korean peninsula, picked up additional local ancestry along the way, and then crossed the strait into Japan to begin the process all over again. Genetic studies confirm this chain directly. Yayoi-associated DNA shows clear affinities with Bronze Age Korean populations, which in turn trace back to Neolithic populations from the Yellow River and Yangtze regions of China, forming what amounts to a genetic corridor running from central China through the Korean peninsula into the Japanese archipelago. This migratory wave carried far more than farming technique with it. It brought languages, social structures, and religious and cultural practices that displaced nearly everything that had existed on the peninsula and the islands before it arrived. Modern Korean and Japanese both belong to language families whose roots trace back to these agricultural migrants, rather than to the hunter-gatherer populations that came before. And whatever languages those original Jomon and pre-farming Korean hunter-gatherer populations actually spoke have been lost entirely, with no direct descendants left to study. The hierarchical social structures, rice-centered cuisines, and agricultural festival traditions that people today think of as quintessentially Korean or Japanese trace their origin to the farming cultures that arrived roughly 3,000 years ago, not to the tens of thousands of years of hunter-gatherer history that came before them. Even within modern Korea and Japan, this migratory history left behind detectable regional fingerprints. Northern and southern Koreans show measurable, if modest, genetic differences, with northern populations carrying slightly stronger affinities to Yellow River-associated ancestry and southern populations showing closer ties to Yangtze-associated groups, a pattern that tracks neatly with geography and the likely routes different waves of migration would have taken into the peninsula. In Japan, the regional pattern is even more pronounced. Populations in Kyushu, where Yayoi migrants first landed, show the highest concentrations of Yayoi-associated ancestry, while Jomon-associated ancestry climbs steadily as you move north through Honshu and up into Hokkaido, home to the Ainu. The Ryukyu Islands, south of the Japanese mainland, show their own distinct genetic profile entirely. A unique blend of Jomon, Yayoi, and later East Asian influence shaped by the island's particular geographic position and history. That regional picture actually got considerably more detailed in 2021, when a separate research team working from newly sequenced ancient Japanese genomes proposed replacing the long-standing dual ancestry model of Japanese origins, Jomon plus Yayoi and nothing else, with what they called a tripartite model instead. Analyzing genomes recovered directly from Jomon, Yayoi, and Kofun period skeletal remains, the researchers confirmed that the Jomon population had genuinely deep roots, having split off from other continental populations somewhere between 20,000 and 15,000 years ago, and maintaining a remarkably small effective population, estimated at only around 1,000 individuals, in relative isolation for millennia, while rising sea levels gradually cut Japan off from the mainland. Rice cultivation, the study confirmed, arrived with people carrying a distinct Northeast Asian genetic signature during the Yayoi period, matching the broader Korea to Japan migration chain already established. But the real surprise in this research was a second, later wave of continental ancestry that nobody had previously identified clearly. Arriving during the Kofun period, Japan's era of early state formation, roughly 1,700 years ago, bringing yet another distinct East Asian genetic signature into the mix, on top of the existing Jomon and Yayoi ancestry. Later genetic work extending the same tripartite framework across the full Japanese archipelago, including detailed studies of the southern Ryukyu Islands, confirmed that no single ancient population, not the Jomon alone, not the Yayoi alone, can fully account for the ancestry of any present-day Japanese population, mainland, or island. Modern Japanese ancestry is better understood as the layered product of at least 3 separate historical migrations, rather than a simple 2-population blend, which means the true genetic picture is even more complex, and even further removed from any notion of an unbroken indigenous lineage than the original 2019 Jomon versus Yayoi framing suggested. This tripartite ancestry doesn't just sit quietly in the genome as historical trivia either. A large biobank study published in 2024, drawing on genetic data from more than 170,000 participants in Biobank Japan and cross-referencing it against the ancient Jomon, Yayoi, and Kofun genomes, found that the proportion of Jomon-derived ancestry a modern Japanese person carries correlates strongly with measurable present-day physical traits, most notably body mass index. Researchers identified over 100 specific genetic variants tied to Jomon ancestry that help predict this kind of variation, and found that individuals carrying a higher proportion of Jomon-derived ancestry tend to show elevated BMI on average compared to those with a higher proportion of Yayoi or Kofun-derived ancestry. It's a striking demonstration that these ancient population splits, three genetically distinct groups that mixed together over roughly 3,000 years, haven't simply been smoothed away into a single homogeneous modern population. Traces of each ancestral group still show up in measurable biology today, quietly shaping things like metabolism and body composition in ways ordinary people walking around Tokyo or Osaka would have no way of knowing about, encoded in genetic variants that trace directly back to hunter-gatherers who lived on these islands more than 10,000 years before the first rice paddy was ever planted. Stepping back, this pattern of demographic replacement isn't unique to Korea and Japan at all. It's simply East Asia's regional expression of something that played out repeatedly across the entire planet during what archaeologists call the Neolithic Revolution. In Europe, farming populations migrating out of the Near East gradually replaced or absorbed the hunter-gatherer populations who had lived there for tens of thousands of years beforehand. Across Africa, Bantu-speaking agricultural and iron-working populations expanded outward from West Africa over several thousand years, replacing or absorbing an enormous range of earlier indigenous groups across the southern two-thirds of the continent. In the Americas, agricultural societies in Mesoamerica and the Andes eventually dwarfed the hunting and gathering populations around them in scale and density. What makes the Korean and Japanese cases genuinely distinctive within this global pattern isn't that the replacement happened, it's how late it happened and just how nearly complete it turned out to be. In many parts of the world, hunter-gatherer ancestry persists at meaningfully higher levels within modern populations than what survives in Korea and Japan today, where the original genetic signal has been reduced to a small residual fraction, concentrated mostly at the geographic margins, in places like Hokkaido, where farming arrived latest and hunting and gathering lifeways persisted longest. There's a genuinely remarkable detail buried inside the Jomon genetic story specifically, one that's easy to skim past, but worth sitting with for a moment. Researchers estimate that the entire Jomon population, spread across the length of the Japanese archipelago for over 10,000 years, maintained an effective population size of only around 1,000 individuals for most of that span, an almost impossibly small number for a population that endured for so many millennia without disappearing entirely. That kind of long-term isolation, cut off from the rest of continental Asia, once rising sea levels closed the ancient land bridges, produced a level of genetic distinctiveness researchers describe as a tight, unusually uniform cluster, clearly set apart from every surrounding mainland population, and unlike almost anything else, recorded among ancient human genomes from this part of the world. It's part of why Jomon DNA is so useful to researchers in the first place. A population that small and that isolated leaves an unusually clean genetic signature, one that shows up clearly in modern Japanese genomes wherever it survives, precisely because it never blended with neighboring continental populations the way almost every other regional group in East Asia did over the same time period. In a strange way, the very thing that made the Jomon population demographically vulnerable to being overwhelmed once agricultural migrants arrived in large numbers is the same thing that makes their genetic legacy so distinct and so traceable within modern Japanese DNA today. There's also a genuinely striking, almost ironic twist buried in all of this genetic research, something that cuts directly against the grain of the historical rivalry between Korea and Japan. Despite centuries of documented conflict, cultural tension, and often bitter national rivalry between the two countries, Koreans and Japanese turn out to be extremely closely related to one another, genetically, considerably more closely related to each other, in fact, than either population is to any modern Chinese population, despite both tracing significant ancestry back to migrations that originated in China. Both populations descend primarily from the same Bronze Age rice farming lineage that expanded out of the Chinese mainland, and the genetic split between what would become distinctly Korean and distinctly Japanese ancestry only occurred around 3,000 years ago, precisely at the point when Yayoi migrants crossed from the southern Korean peninsula into Japan. Before that split, genetically speaking, they were effectively the same population. This shared deep ancestry helps explain the long-recognized linguistic and cultural parallels between Korean and Japanese cultures, parallels that people have often struggled to fully account for given the two nations' long history of political conflict and mutual antagonism. The similarity, it turns out, isn't coincidence or convergent cultural borrowing. It's a direct reflection of common biological origin. None of this is a small or comfortable finding, and it hasn't been received quietly in either country. Korean and Japanese national identity, like the national identity of many countries, is built partly on foundational stories of ancient, unbroken indigenous origin. In Korea, the traditional Daegun myth traces Korean ancestry back roughly 5,000 years to a legendary founding god-king. The genetic evidence indicates that anything resembling a distinct Korean population, in a genetic sense, didn't really exist until around 3,500 years ago, at the very earliest, once the rice farming migrations from China had already substantially reshaped the peninsula's population. In Japan, Shinto tradition traces the imperial lineage back to the sun goddess Amaterasu, describing an unbroken chain of divine rulers stretching back into deep antiquity. The genetic evidence instead shows that the Yayoi migrants, who would eventually become Japan's ruling and majority population, arrived only around 3,000 years ago, and that a second wave of continental ancestry arrived even later still, during the Kofun period, layering directly on top of a Jomon population that had, by that point, already been largely displaced. These findings have understandably sparked genuine and ongoing debate among historians and anthropologists working in both countries. Some researchers have embraced the new genetic picture as simply a more accurate, evidence-based account of the past, one that in no way diminishes the extraordinary civilizations that Korea and Japan went on to build. Others push back, arguing that genetic ancestry alone cannot capture the full meaning of a people's history, and that cultural continuity, the languages, values, and institutions passed down and continuously reshaped over 3,000 years, matters just as much as, or arguably more than, the specific biological origins of the people carrying that culture forward. That's a legitimate and serious argument, and it isn't really a scientific one. It's a philosophical question about what national identity is actually built from. But whatever position anyone takes on that question, it doesn't change what the DNA itself shows. It's also worth being honest about why this particular strand of genetic research generates so much more public attention than, say, a study on ancient European ancestry might. Both Korean and Japanese national narratives, at various points over the past century and a half, were pressed into service for explicitly political purposes, used to justify colonial expansion, to draw sharp lines of ethnic superiority or purity, or to argue for one nation's supposed historical claim over the other. Colonial-era Japanese scholarship, in particular, sometimes attempted to argue that Koreans and Japanese shared common ancient stock specifically to justify Japan's annexation of Korea in the early 20th century. A deeply political misuse of ancestry claims that still colors how sensitively this kind of genetic research has to be handled and communicated today. Modern geneticists working in this field are generally careful to separate the biological findings from any of that historical baggage, emphasizing repeatedly that shared or replaced ancestry says absolutely nothing about the relative worth, sophistication, or legitimacy of either nation, only about the demographic history of the people who happen to live there. But the sensitivity is real, and it's part of why this research, despite being grounded in the same rigorous ancient DNA methodology used everywhere else in the world, tends to provoke a noticeably sharper public reaction in Seoul and Tokyo than similar findings do almost anywhere else. And what the DNA shows, stripped down to its simplest form, is this. Modern Koreans and modern Japanese are not the direct genetic descendants of the people who first settled the Korean peninsula and the Japanese archipelago tens of thousands of years ago. They are, in overwhelming genetic proportion, the descendants of agricultural migrants who moved outward from China beginning several thousand years ago, and who demographically replaced the original hunter-gatherer inhabitants of both regions over the course of roughly 1,000 years in each case, not through violent conquest, but through the simple, relentless mathematics of population growth that agriculture makes possible, and hunting and gathering never could match. That doesn't make Korean or Japanese culture any less real, any less legitimate, or any less remarkable. The civilizations that emerged from these migrations, the languages, religious traditions, artistic movements, and political systems that Korea and Japan built over the following 3 millennia are genuine historical achievements in their own right, regardless of exactly where their most distant biological ancestors happen to originate. What ancient DNA has actually handed us is simply a more accurate account of how those civilizations began, not with divine founders or legendary kings, but with successive waves of ordinary farmers carrying millet, then rice, then bronze and iron tools, moving into new territory and gradually building the demographic and cultural foundation for nations that would eventually become major regional and global powers. The hunter-gatherers who lived across Korea and Japan for tens of thousands of years before any of this began have been almost completely forgotten by history in every sense that matters. Their languages are extinct, with no direct descendants left to reconstruct them from. Their distinctive cultural and spiritual practices survive only in fragmentary archaeological traces, pottery styles, shell mounds, burial patterns, pieced together by researchers working from physical remains rather than living tradition. Their genetic legacy persists today only as a faint residual signal, diluted down to roughly 1/10 of the ancestry carried by modern populations in the regions they once fully inhabited, concentrated most strongly at the geographic edges, in places like Hokkaido, where the older way of life managed to survive the longest before it too was eventually overwhelmed. They endured ice ages, sea level rise, and thousands of years of unrecorded history, and then, within a comparatively short span of a few thousand years, they were almost entirely absorbed and erased once agriculture reached their shores. That is the real story ancient DNA has uncovered here, not a myth about pure, unbroken bloodlines stretching back to the dawn of time, but a far more universal and far more human story about migration, demographic replacement, and the sheer transformative power of agricultural technology to remake entire regions and entire peoples within the span of a few thousand years. A story that geneticists are still actively rewriting today, one newly sequenced ancient genome at a time. And maybe that's the detail worth carrying away from all of this. Every new genome pulled from a Jomon shell mound, every fragment of DNA extracted from a burial in the Korean countryside, adds one more small correction to a picture that turns out to be far more layered than either national myth ever imagined. 3 overlapping waves in Japan rather than 2, millet farmers from the Wesleo River sitting even earlier in the story than the rice farmers of the Yangtze, an entire vanished population surviving today only as a 10% echo scattered through the genomes of people who have no idea it's there. None of it was written down anywhere, because the people carrying that history had no writing system left to record it in, and no descendants left in large enough numbers to pass the memory down. The only reason we know any of it happened at all is because bone, unlike memory or myth, holds on to the truth, whether anyone was ever meant to read it or not, and because a small number of geneticists were curious enough and patient enough to go looking for it.